doing the course map today, okay? All right, so I sort of just did that. You're getting the context. You've learned the basics of economics. You've learned some historical things that were, I hope, surprisingly relevant last week, or on Tuesday. And then today, you're going to learn about the philosophical underpinnings. And again, we're trying to do something that I don't think has ever been done before, which is to connect the liberal arts with entrepreneurship, not just in a general way by saying that it's good to know how to think and how to talk, be creative and articulate your ideas, which is what we normally say when we're telling people about why liberal arts education is important. We're actually taking specific content and connecting that to entrepreneurship and how it's practiced. And so today you're going to hear from the former chair of the philosophy department, one of the great, most well-recognized teachers at Carolina, the Moorhead alumni distinguished professor of philosophy, Geoffrey Sayre-McCord. So, Jeff.
Testing. You guys can all hear me? Well, it's no benefit. Oh, here's the answer. That's what Sayre-McCord thinks. And if you didn't get it right, it's worth going back through the article and trying to figure out why he thinks that's the right answer, the right way to respond to the risk of scandal, scandals like LIBOR. Lee, is this now under my control?
It should be.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah.
So, I've been in the private sector hardly at all. And I know not all of you who are interested in entrepreneurship are specifically interested in entering the private sector. But I thought it was worth mentioning that my whole experience in the private sector consisted first of being a professional auto mechanic, not very entrepreneurial, then being a programmer for a small firm in Philadelphia, and then very briefly doing cost-benefit analyses for a consulting firm in Princeton. So I come to the topic of entrepreneurship not myself having a great deal of experience. So like any reasonable scholar, I decided to do some research. And the first place I went was to talk to people I considered to be experts. So to a recently retired CEO of one of the largest banks in the United States. And we spent hours talking about entrepreneurship and philosophy, and specifically about entrepreneurship and ethics. And then I met with the director of with the director of one of the leading investment banks in New York. Again, several hours of conversation. Then with the state treasurer. Then with roughly a dozen very successful venture capitalists. Then over 20 successful entrepreneurs, about 8 of them at Holden's home. And a good supply of bank loan officers who are on the front lines dealing with entrepreneurs. The way I'm thinking about today's lecture, and you guys know there's 2 lectures. There's today's lecture, which is a provocation and a setting up a kind of challenge for you all. And then Tuesday's lecture, which turns to trying to address the challenge I think you all face. So I'm thinking about what I'm doing. This reflects my experience with the consulting firm as a kind of cost-benefit analysis. Really, as an exercise, as I'm viewing it, having consulted with all those people, as an exercise in risk management. So I want to focus first on the rewards of being an entrepreneur. And just remind you, first of all, the obvious possible rewards are financial for a lot of kinds of entrepreneurship. But I want to mention a couple of important things about this possible large upside to being an entrepreneur. First of all, several studies, and one very large study, shows that if you look at the career of entrepreneurs compared to the career of equally educated people who are employees of large firms, over a 10-year period, they earn a median salary, a median remuneration, salary and other benefits, 35% less than the salaried employee. So that if you're thinking of getting into entrepreneurship, in order to make a lot of money, you should just pay attention to the fact that measuring median incomes, you probably do better not being an entrepreneur. On the same point, though, it's worth emphasizing what I heard from several of the venture capitalists, which is when they're looking to invest in an entrepreneurial enterprise, they're very concerned not to be speaking to someone who is in it for the money. They look for people who believe in what they're the value of what they're trying to develop, not in the potential for getting it rich. I'm reminded of a discussion in the Jobs book, where Jobs is in Hawaii and he's taking a walk with his best friend. I'm blanking on the guy's name. Oracle.
Ellison, right?
Yeah. And Ellison is urging him to do a hostile takeover of Apple. And as they're talking about it, Jobs is emphasizing he wants to put a dent in the universe. He wants to create something magnificent. And Ellison is saying, but how are we going to make money? I'm all about money. And Jobs says to him, it's really good that I'm your best friend, that I'm your friend, because I can tell you, Larry, you have enough money. And Larry responds and says, yeah, but I want more. I don't want somebody else to get it. A venture capitalist is usually in it for the money. A successful entrepreneur, I've been told by the people I consulted, it's systematically true that they have to be in it for something else. Because part of the entrepreneurial enterprise is to face the prospect of failure. And you will face the prospect of financial failure early on. And if all you care about is money, the chances that you'll stick it out, if you don't care about the value of what you're producing, chances that you won't stick it out are very high. So just a reminder, not only does it probably not make sense to be in it for the money, it's also such that entrepreneurs view those who are in it for the money as a less good risk than those who see some other value in what they're doing. So I want to just flag some of those other values. So this is actually really hard to read. Is it hard for you guys, or can you see the orangish stuff? So what are the rewards other than money? One obvious possible reward is to be promoting employment. And it turns out that entrepreneurial enterprises do, in various ways, promote employment. They also are highly volatile. So the number, proportional to their size, of jobs created and jobs lost is much higher for entrepreneurial enterprises than for established firms. Nonetheless, the ones that do survive have created new jobs. There's also evidence of knock-on effects. So in cultures where there are entrepreneurial enterprises, non-entrepreneurial enterprises also tend to thrive and often will hire the spin-offs of failed entrepreneurial enterprises. Another thing you might think, when you're not thinking of what you're in it for yourself financially, is you might think being an entrepreneurial enterprise will contribute to innovation. Will create new and exciting things that are less likely to be created by you if you were in an established firm. It's worth mentioning that the evidence on this is a bit equivocal. If you measure number of patents, even relative to size, or the number of new innovative products as measured by others measuring what counts as innovative, larger firms invest more in research and development and get more patents and produce more innovative products. On the other hand, they do it much less efficiently. And one cool study is that if you're an entrepreneur in a university, it's clear that an innovator in a university, it's clear that the most efficient way to get your products out to market are through small entrepreneurial businesses rather than large established firms. They're much more efficient at getting things to market. Okay, so next thing just mentioned, flying by this, you might think it promotes productivity, entrepreneurial firms. The evidence is that the per person productivity of entrepreneurial firms is much lower than established firms. And their contribution to, let me just make sure I get it. There are complicated facts about that if this was economics I'd go into, but you have economists to talk about these measures. There's also ambiguous evidence about total factor productivity and what entrepreneurial firms as opposed to established firms contribute to that. On the other hand, the growth of value contributed by an entrepreneurial firm is sky high compared to Hewlett-Packard or Apple or other established firms. Similarly, the growth of total factor productivity is sky high. So if you're concerned about innovation, there's a powerful argument for going into an entrepreneurial context rather than an established firm. Most strikingly, though, you'll remember that the median income of people in entrepreneurial enterprises is over 10 years, 35% lower. Job satisfaction is exponentially greater for people in entrepreneurial firms. So if you measure satisfaction by income, and there are studies that do this, they infer that employees in entrepreneurial enterprises are less satisfied. But if you do questionnaires of job satisfaction, they show entrepreneurs are overwhelmingly more satisfied with their job than their counterparts in established firms. Okay, so that was just a quick run through to remind you of the risks, of the rewards, and to sort of highlight that if you are entrepreneurial, it makes sense for you, if you're going to continue doing it, to see what you're doing as valuable independent of the financial rewards you hope to get from it. If you're not like that, you're probably placing a lottery-style bad bet with your future. So the main thing just so far is start to canvass the things you might value. Job satisfaction, contributing to innovation, contributing to economic health of your community, the things other than reward for you that you think are worth pursuing, if you're going to spend your time this way. So I want to shift to the risk side of this. And of course, an obvious risk is financial. As you learned in the last lecture, the odds of failing are huge. It's rare, unheard of recently that I know of in the United States, that you might suffer castration. But, which I heard Abelard suffered for a different kind of failure, not an entrepreneurial failure so far as I understand it. But the financial risks are huge. The odds if you're in an entrepreneurial business, now maybe not for the money, the odds that you'll lose a lot of money or lose a lot of other people's money, very high. The other major risk, let's say you think what you're trying to produce really is worthwhile independent of making it rich. There's a real chance that that very valuable thing, as you see it, is something you can't pull off. So there's a real risk that you will commit time and energy to creating something new and valuable that just won't make it. There's also a lot of evidence that entrepreneurs have less successful long-term romantic relationships. Just so you know, just in case you're starting to get friendly with somebody else in the class, just keep in mind the divorce rate for entrepreneurs is much higher than for people in established businesses.
Easily understood.
Pardon me?
That makes sense. But I would argue that the marriages that survive it are even stronger.
Are even stronger, yeah. That which does not kill you.
Yeah.
Unless you live in Utah, where the data is that entrepreneurs actually are more likely to have successful marriages than non-entrepreneurs. Now, I don't know whether that's an argument to move to Utah or just what, but it was an interesting fluke in the data. Okay, but there's another risk that I want to talk to you about. A moral risk. Before I tell you about the moral risk I see looming, let me just remind you. Wait. Do we not have those slides of the people I consulted? I thought they were in here too.
Yeah, they are in there.
They're somewhere else. That's all right. Let me just remind you. CEO, top investment banker, state treasurer, scads of venture capitalists, scads of entrepreneurs, scads of people who are at the front lines loaning money. All of them were people I asked the following question to. Actually, let me back up and frame the question. As I see it, a lot of careers are such that they make those who follow that path unusually vulnerable to certain moral failings, to certain vices. So for instance, if you're a professor, among the things you're vulnerable to is thinking you're really interesting. The number of professors who, not just in the classroom where people are forced to listen to them, but outside of the classroom think they're very interesting, is sky high. We're disproportionately confident of our intrinsic interest. And it's not a surprise, because our daily work life is a life in which people who are already interested in our subjects are talking to us about it, and students in our classes, in order to get through the classes, have to be paying attention. It's no surprise we make the mistake of saying, oh, real pearls I've got here. Similarly, if you ask people about surgeons, is there any particular moral weakness, vice, that surgeons are especially liable to? A lot of people will tell you, yes, they have a tendency to acquire the God complex. To not just in the operating room, but in the rest of their life, think they can make no mistake, think they understand things better than everybody else in the room. And this is no surprise. Once you understand who gets selected for being a surgeon, what kind of environment they work in, and all the good reasons for their environment being the way it is, it's not surprising that a lot of surgeons end up having this kind of God complex. Now, just a crucial reminder, it's not that all professors suffer the vice of thinking they're more interesting than they are. Some of us are truly deeply interesting, right? So, similarly, not all surgeons suffer the vice of thinking they can make no mistake, of assuming they know more than everyone, of not being willing to tolerate questioning of their authority. But a lot of them do, and for understandable reasons. So I asked all the people I consulted, is there similarly a vice, a moral weakness, that entrepreneurs are prone to? It's not that all entrepreneurs suffer this vice, but is there something about the career of being an entrepreneur that tilts you towards, that makes you vulnerable to any particular vice? And very much to my surprise, there was virtual unanimity from, oh, here's the list, just to remind you. Virtually unanimous in saying of entrepreneurs, and this includes entrepreneurs saying it of other entrepreneurs. I wasn't asking them, what's your vice? But I said, you know a lot of entrepreneurs. If there was a vice many of them have because of the work, what is it? I spoke to venture capitalists, bankers, state treasurer. They all gave the same answer. And it varied slightly in the word they used, but the gist of it was, the core, they risk being dishonest. They risk being liars. One person started telling me this by saying, when I said, what's this risk? He says, Thanksgiving. I said, what? And he said, yeah, at Thanksgiving, I'm there with all my family, and they're all really mad at me. And I said, why? I said, because they think I lied to them. And I said, talk to him some more. I said, well, did you? And he said, well, you know, I thought it was going to be more successful than it was. And they're grown adults, and it wasn't my job to keep reminding them that they couldn't afford to lose the money. I said, so you misled them, or you failed to mention things that you thought were relevant. He ended up saying, yeah, and that's why I hate Thanksgiving. Similarly, in conversations, I had several people tell me a mark of a good target to invest in is that they failed, and there are other investors who failed with them who are coming back to reinvest on a new venture. Because that's a mark that in the first project, they dealt with their investors honestly, and that's a rare and cherished thing. Many of them explained what it was about the career of an entrepreneur that led people naturally, predictably, at least risking becoming dishonest. It starts with the fact that for almost every entrepreneurial enterprise you might go into, all the evidence is, the overwhelming evidence at least, it's going to fail. Huge numbers of entrepreneurial enterprises fail. So the odds that yours is going to succeed are very small. And so people start by having a disproportionate confidence in their particular project. Often this is completely honest, but not accurate. And then, having gotten this confidence, they get investors. And often in getting the initial round of investors, who tend to be family and friends, they completely honestly tell them what the upside is, what's so attractive, articulate all the reasons they're excited about what they're about to do. But then as the project carries on, they learn what they didn't know, just how likely it is they're going to fail. This is why it's so important to venture capitalists that entrepreneurs not be in the enterprise just for the money, because there comes a point when the odds that you're going to lose a lot go very high. And so what you have to do is get a second round of investment. But now you know more than you did before. But now much more is at stake. It's your money, your friend's money, your family's money, all these people you've convinced to come on board on what you believed in, you now realize with disproportionate confidence. Now, for some people, the enterprise works out and they acquire a new confidence in the value of them having misled. And others fail and never realize that they had miscalculated things in the first place. And many entrepreneurs never lie or mislead anyone. But if these experts are right, this is not my judgment, I don't know. The only entrepreneurs I know I have complete faith in, my sister-in-law and Buck, and a few others. Holden, complete faith. But if they're right, you guys, any of you who become entrepreneurs, should be worrying not just about losing money, but about losing your integrity. Not because it's inevitable, but because the circumstances you'll find yourself in will tend to urge you in that direction. All the more so, because when you're in an entrepreneurial business, you're in a context where there are not clear rules. There are not sharp lines. There are huge benefits to be gained and serious losses that might be suffered. And so it's easy to find yourself crossing those blurred lines and then rationalizing what you've done. But the overall effect, if those experts are right, is often that you become a person other people can't trust. Not just in your dealings with venture capitalists, but in the rest of your life too. One hypothesis, I'm in no position to test it, is one of the reasons for the high divorce rate everywhere except Utah is that the dishonesty slops over from the exercise of trying to get investment to your relationships with those in your family. So, I want to remind you that being forewarned, which is what I consider this, be careful, if you're an entrepreneur, you're at greater risk than you would be otherwise of eventually finding yourself at 40 a liar. Maybe not a liar who can recognize this in herself, maybe a liar who lies to herself, but someone that other people think she can't be trusted. That's the risk. This is the forewarning. It's important, though, to recognize that being forewarned is not really being forearmed. Just knowing this is a risk isn't yet any kind of information about how you might address the risk. So one of the things to note about Sayre-McCord's article is he concludes, as I say, saying there needs to be more enforcement and also more efforts to prevent the lying that's endemic, as he sees it, to the financial sectors. He says we also have to prevent it, but he says nothing really about how that's to be done. So an important question, if you're in a company responsible for the behavior of others and you want it to be an honest company, an important question is, so how do I prevent cheating? And if you're not in that position, if you're just you and you're concerned about your integrity, an important question is, how do I guard myself? What kind of prophylactic should I use to make it less likely that I'll end up at 40, the kind of person that now I wish I'd never become? Just knowing it's a risk is no particular help, though it's better than not knowing it's a risk. So let me just remind you of a couple of cool experiments that highlight why just thinking, I don't want to be a liar, and just thinking, oh, I may be at greater risk if I'm an entrepreneur, is not really very good protection. So the first thing, I'm just going to run through these. I'm happy to talk to you at greater length about any of the studies I'll mention. The first is the Milgram experiments. How many of you have heard of the Milgram experiments? Raise your hands higher. Okay, a fair number. Look, keep your hands up for a sec. Those of you who don't know there are other people in class to go. Raise your hand. Come on, don't wimp out. You can go to these people and ask them about it too. So the Milgram experiments were originally carried out on the hypothesis that there was something distinctively bad about German culture that led Germans to be much more likely than those in other cultures to go with authority and do abhorrent things just because those in power. Did I do something or did? Okay, that's all right. So Milgram thought, well, let me test this hypothesis. And he took people and he put them in the room where they thought what they were doing was training people to be better at solving problems. And the setup was the training involved giving them shocks. And there was a co-conspirator who was getting the shocks. And what the study revealed is an outrageously large proportion of college students in the US, if told by a guy in a white coat to turn the dial up to the danger level, with the conspirator screaming and saying he didn't want to be in the experiment anymore, to stop it, he had a bad heart, a huge proportion of American college students followed authority. And willingly, though with anxiety, turned the electricity up to what was marked dangerous levels, just to comply with somebody in a white coat who seemed to have authority. What the experiment suggests is the self-satisfied thought that it's a distortion in German culture that makes them overweening to authority probably was completely false, and it was much more a general aspect of human nature, that even those who know that what they're doing is wrong will, under certain circumstances, do it anyway. This experiment actually seriously damaged many of the students who were in the experiment. And it's now banned. You can't run this kind of experiment. IRB has some sort of problem with destroying people's lives. I don't really know why. Right? We can't still do this, can we?
No.
Okay. So that's one experiment. Here's another experiment. These are all just to remind you that having a kind of firm grip on the thought, I don't want to become a liar, isn't that much protection against being one. And I'm just temporarily assuming you don't want to be a liar. That's up for grabs. But I'm just going to assume that temporarily. Another experiment, often referred to as the Good Samaritan experiment, for reasons you'll understand quickly. Any of you know this experiment, carried out at Princeton Theological Seminary? Just a couple of people, 3 or 4. So at Princeton, they took students in the Princeton Theological Seminary. They first asked them to explain why they were in the school. Were they in it for its own sake or for some ulterior motive? Were they just trying to get a good paying career or trying to get into heaven? Or did they think the service they would provide was valuable independently of rewards to them? The attempt was to distinguish kinds of character. And then they had them take a little course on potential careers for those in theology school. And they had half of them read a little article about alternative careers. They had the other half read the parable of the Good Samaritan. So you have people that we have evidence they're at least in the career they're in for different kinds of reasons. They either value the religious study for its own sake or they see it as a means to some end. And you've got some people who've read a career advancing article and others who've read the parable of the Good Samaritan. And now they're told one of 3 things. You need to go to the building next door to give a little lecture. You're late. You need to go to the building next door. They're expecting you soon. You need to go to the building next door. You have a few minutes. Each then left to go to the next building and outside on these beautiful grounds. This is not some slum, not some place where people would feel uncomfortable, just beautiful grounds in Princeton, New Jersey. They come across a man slumped in a doorway, head down, obviously in trouble, and the real experiment was, who will stop to help? Turns out, the overwhelmingly dominant factor wasn't whether they were in religious studies as a means or as an end. It wasn't whether they had read the parable of the Good Samaritan or not. The overwhelming determinant of whether they stopped to help a person in trouble was whether they were late for a trivial meeting. Almost no one who was late stopped. Fewer than half who weren't late yet stopped. The only people who stopped, the greatest proportion of the people who stopped, were the people who thought they had extra time. So you can imagine among the people who read the parable of the Good Samaritan, they would even have in their minds that it's good to help others. And yet, if they were late, they wouldn't. If they weren't late, but they just had another appointment, they wouldn't. This is some evidence that even if you're committed to something, trivial things, such as you're late for a nothing sort of training, that could certainly be rescheduled, will keep you from helping someone who's in need. Trivial things about your work environment might keep you from paying attention to your integrity, worrying about whether you're honest, even if you're committed to honesty. We're so influenced by the circumstances we find ourselves in. Another experiment, there used to be things called payphones, where you slip coins in them. You can still see them at some airports and a few places. Well, they did an experiment where people would go to the payphone, and there were 2 experimental conditions. Either they would find a dime in the coin slot, or they wouldn't. And then a Confederate would come by and drop a pile of papers, obviously needing help. Most of the people who found a dime in the payphone helped. Almost none of the people who didn't find a dime helped. An overwhelming determinant of whether they bothered to help someone pick up papers was that whether they had happened to be on something wholly unrelated, a little bit of luck. These aren't people who thought to themselves, surely they didn't think this. I got a dime, now I have time to waste helping people. These are people who were unaware of what was affecting how they would carry out their life. even in dramatic contexts where presumably a number of them thought helping those in need was worth doing if it was easy, at least. Final game just to mention, I won't go into the details, but there's something called a prisoner's dilemma, which is a particular game theoretic structure that gives people basically two options: to cooperate together, where they do pretty well, or to defect in the hope that they'll be a big winner. So it's either cooperate or defect. Pitting people in, those of you who know, how many of you can know about prisoner's dilemmas? Okay. So they would set up a game where there were 7 iterations of prisoner's dilemma, so you'd know when it would come to at the end, and the question was who's going to cheat, and when will they cheat, and who won't. It turns out that a huge determiner of how many cheat on the first move and how many cheat on the 7th, last move, is what the game is called. If it's called the Wall Street game, huge proportion of people defect from the very start. If it's called community, a huge proportion of people cooperate from the very start. There's no reason to think of the samples of people. Some people are goody two-shoes and others are ruthless sharks. It's evidence that how the interaction is framed, and this is completely understandable, how the interaction is framed changes how you interact with other people. Maybe what the name Wall Street game does is it primes you for thinking the other person's going to defect anyway. So you do a protective move. Whatever it is, it shows that how things are talked about, how they're framed, how you're led to think about what you're about to do will shape how you interact with other people. If you go into a venture capital meeting thinking, well, they're grown-ups, caveat emptor, whatever I can get them to buy, it's their own damn fault if they don't pay attention, thinking that will lead you more often to be willing to lie to them, because that's moved the line of responsibility for suffering the lie onto their shoulders. So, is there a way to bring up those alternative multiple choice questions? I just want to talk about that. There's no easy way. The ones from the start.
The one at the beginning?
Yeah.
You could just flip back. Or I can. I can move straight
I
there.
can do that.
Here, I can move straight there.
Okay, cool. So, what Sayre-McCord thinks, I just will mention he's a UNC graduate. He was here last year, gave a fabulous talk on the wisdom of groups, on the extent to which groups working together, especially if they're heterogeneous, much more often get the right answers to all sorts of questions, including mathematical questions, much more often than homogeneous groups or single experts. So in the course of this short article in the New Yorker on LIBOR, he ends up saying that the evidence is these scandals are endemic. It's not a few rogue traders. It's the whole culture, he thinks. He's in a much better place than I am, and so I don't know whether he's right about this or not. So he definitely doesn't think, he thinks it's a mere excuse when you hear, oh, it's just a few rogue traders. The whole incentive structure, he thinks, is set up so that the rewards turn on the deals made and not on, for instance, the preservation of a good name. Which, when a lot of people say the market enforces integrity, when they argue for that, their argument is it enforces integrity because if a bank gets known as corrupt, it's going to lose customers. So it's really important to the bank to maintain its reputation for integrity. That may be true, but the first thing to recognize is banks don't know how to do that, by and large. And other financial institutions seem not to know how to do that, even if it's really important to them. Secondly, within the bank, the motivations of the individual agents aren't tied to maintaining their integrity. at least according to him. He does, as you know, think there ought to be increased regulation. He grants that it would be intrusive and overbearing, but he thinks that's the only solution. I'm going to ask you to read a little bit of Dan Ariely's work for Tuesday. He's a behavioral economist at Duke who's done some interesting experiments about the extent to which threats of punishment, especially the scale of the threat, seems to make very little difference to the likelihood of people cheating. It'll be a short set of readings. But he's dubious that just increasing penalties will make a huge difference. And he's highly skeptical that the market without regulators will look after itself. So all of that said, now can we go back to...
1 second.
And were there questions up here?
Yes.
Okay, good.
The screen ended.
The screen collapsed. So I should have said early on, I'm happy to be interrupted at any point, and I'm not good at not just talking. So I didn't really look at the screen when it was up there. So let me just say a couple of more things, and then open it for questions and continue the discussion.
Is this where you want to be?
Forearming, yes. So you'll remember, right before this, I just reminded you of the extent to which we're influenced, we're shaped in what we're likely to do by features of our situation that we're not always cognizant of. And the shaping can lead us to do things that after the fact, we recognize as wrong, and we wish we had not done it. Walking by somebody in need just to make an appointment that you could have been late for. So, one of the things that was interesting about Sayre-McCord that I've already mentioned is he talks about trying to prevent a culture of lying, to structure the environment so there'll be less cheating in the financial sector. He doesn't really tell us anything about how to do it. And he certainly doesn't tell you anything about how you might avoid becoming a liar. A liar. Lawyer is something else. Okay, so I want to, as a bit of an assignment for you, and this is where I'm really not assuming you care whether you're a liar or not. The assignment before Tuesday is to spend some time doing an inventory of what features of your character you want to preserve or acquire. What are the traits of character? Maybe you've been prompted by jobs as an exemplar of the kind of person you want to be. Maybe you're not yet ruthless enough in your own mind. Maybe you can't bend reality. That was their phrase for dissembling or lying to himself and to others. Maybe you think you should be more like that. That's really not the issue for the assignment. Figure out what traits of character, what kind of person you think it's important to be. What traits that you have that are worth having, or what traits you hope you can cultivate. Do a kind of inventory in much the way you would do if you were an athlete or an actor, thinking about how to be excellent, where you sort of canvas what are your shortcomings and what are your strengths, and improving what would make you better how. Spend some time thinking about yourself in that way, figuring out what things, what ways of being, what traits you might have you value having. Let me warn you that our common culture doesn't make that all that easy. Our vocabulary is seriously impoverished. Think of the ways you criticize people. We got to turn off the cameras or something? Well, I won't quite say them, but I'll remind you. Oh, he's such a schmuck. He's an a-hole. What a jerk. What, I can run down the list. Ask yourself, what's the difference between those? I mean, there are so many ways to be a jerk. Think about the different ways. And similarly, there are so many ways to be a decent person. to be a person you admire that you would hope to become or hope to stay. Our common culture doesn't empower us with regular use of a fine-grained vocabulary in order to pick out those traits. I'm asking you nonetheless to try to think about the difference between being generous, being kind, being benevolent, all related but not the same, being a person of integrity, being someone who won't lie, related, not the same, person who has strength of will, who can be counted on. Think of those traits, making them as fine-grained as you possibly can. And start to get a reflective view of which ones you hope you will sustain or acquire for Tuesday. Against that background, oh, this is the thing. Can I make it? I want to bring this home for my cat. So, okay. The main reading for next Tuesday is reading Aristotle on the acquisition of virtue and vice. His theory is still the dominant theory of how you acquire the kind of character you have, for better or worse. And so we're going to spend some time, and it's important you read the text carefully, working through his positive account of how you could make yourself ruthless if that's what you care to be. How people can become people of integrity if they're not. How the jerks you know became the jerks they are. The idea is, the more you can understand how you acquire or lose your character traits, the more you'll be in a position to defend against the derailment that a context the entrepreneurial enterprise will put you in will tend to lean you towards. So what I'd like to do at this point, I'm not going to go into Aristotle. I'm not going to go into Ariely's interesting work, so that's for Tuesday. But I want to spend some time now just addressing questions. You should be worrying about things like, what's the difference between just selling things, misleading people, being a liar? To whom, under what context, do you owe people a full story? How can you protect yourself in contexts such as you might be facing in the near future? So I want to just open it up. Is this appropriate? I'd like to open it up for questions. I'm sorry I didn't read them when they were posted. Are people shy about asking questions in this? It's a problem about giving one lecture. If in my class you end up having to speak normally. So, anybody have any questions? Any puzzles? Yes?
Would you say of the mentors and people you consulted that the men that you would consider men of integrity were happier, easier to get along with? Was there any correlation between, I guess, life satisfaction and integrity?
It's a good question. Let me just repeat it. So, in light of my conversations with these people I consider experts, did I get any evidence that being an honest person was correlated with being satisfied either with your life or with your job? And the fact is, I didn't get any evidence one way or the other. I should say, I don't know many of these people well enough to know whether they have integrity themselves. That's why it's important. Part of my questions were not what's your virtue or your vice, but tell me about these other people. I would think that if you happen to be one of those people who cares to be a person of integrity, succeeding in that could be a source of great satisfaction, whatever the other costs.
Hey, Jack?
Yeah. That's a superb question. So the first thing to ask yourself is, what matters? Which competition are you in? Because the competition you're in and the winning or lose, the measures of winning or losing will shape how you think about this. I have no evidence that, well, let me quote Woodrow Wilson. He said, if I can get this right, a great wind of moral force is blowing through history, and he who stands against that wind shall fall in disgrace. Now that seems hopelessly optimistic and peculiar. Probably unbelievable now for many of you. He thought you will win thanks to the winds of moral force if you maintain your integrity. I don't know that there's any evidence for that. So if your question is, what will help me rise at Smith Barney, or at Lazard, or at Citibank? Being honest to my clients or selling them packages that I get indirect benefits from? I don't know enough to know which way we'll win. So if your measure is, will you keep the job, will you move up the ranks? Maybe the answer is, you've got no hope of winning that competition with those people, if you're honest. On the other hand, I do believe many people who are entrepreneurs, many people who are in business, many of the people I did consult with who are my close friends, I think are people of integrity. I said I don't know all of them, I don't know about their character, but I know a lot of them. So I do believe you're not guaranteed to lose if you don't have integrity. So, where'd that question go? Okay, so in a world where there is so much lying, how can we hope to compete while being honest? I think the first answer is, it sure looks to me like there are a lot of people who do succeed and do maintain their integrity. It also looks to me like a lot of people at crucial points come to think the only way I can succeed is by lying. And I'm in no position to say they're wrong if they measure success financially. If part of the measure of success is maintaining your integrity, one thing you know is you lost that at that point.
You've got a slew of things behind
Okay. Somebody once wrote, the thing about honesty is once you can fake that, the rest is a piece of cake. Oh. Anyway. What about dishonesty with good intentions? It's a good question. This is why I've asked you to, I've made clear, I'm not telling you being honest all the time is the way you ought to be. I'm leaving it open on purpose for you to decide what kind of person you think it's worth being. You might well be the kind of person who thinks sometimes, to help others, dishonesty is the right thing to do. I guess that's what people are thinking of good intentions. So you might think you'd have to be a kind of annoying prig to never lie to anyone. I'm not judging that. But I'm saying there's a very big difference between doing something to help another person, doing it to that person to help that person, and doing something that won't help that person, or doing something to one person to help somebody else. Those are three different ways you might be thinking of lying. And it may be that the right thing to think is sometimes under some circumstances lying with good intentions is all right. Probably depends on who the goodness is hoped for. Yeah, hand up? Yeah.
Yeah, this sort of ties in with some of the questions that were being asked, but
Okay.
I read an article recently about like applying Machiavellian ethics to modern business, and so like and it was talking about like basically sacrificing all ethics to get into power and then using that to be benevolent.
Right.
So do you think that in a world with a lot of like lying and where lying generally tends to be rewarding, do you think that would be successful, or do you think that's the way we lose ourselves?
So let me repeat the question. Machiavelli had the idea that in politics, if you have the potential to be successful, the right strategy is throw ethics out the window, get absolute power, and then enforce it. ethics on an otherwise anarchistic environment. You might think similarly, that's what I should do in business. Anarchistic environment full of liars, I should lie, get really successful like Bill Gates, turn around and do a lot of good. Or you hear this on NPR, I forget which of the moguls it is, who left a whole lot of money and says it's for permanent good. Yeah, Carnegie. Okay, he did ruthless things as a businessman, but then he turned around and his fortune has helped so many people. He established a huge number of public libraries. So you might have a Machiavellian view. You might think that's the right strategy. I want to caution you about the odds of being successful in just that way, that you can do a huge amount of good. But I also want to remind you that it's probably a mistake, though it's got to be your own judgment here, to think the measure of success is financial. To think you've succeeded if you're rich, no matter what the cost to your character, to your family, to your relationship with others. I really don't, I'm a philosopher. I'm in a fact-free enterprise. I don't know what the statistics are on the happiness of ruthless people. There's a famous book called Habits of the Heart by Robert Bellah, which it's beautifully written. The research is kind of, no, it really is badly done. So the data doesn't really support well what they're saying, but their thesis, Robert Bellah and I forget the other authors, is that those who care about something other, did this just stop working?
No, you're good.
Okay, that people who care about something other than themselves are much happier. If that's right, and you're worried about being well off yourself, the first lesson, this is often called the paradox of hedonism, is stop worrying about yourself, how much money you have, and whether you're happy. Start caring about other people. Yeah. It did stop.
To the battery.
Yes. So that's a partial answer to the Machiavellian thought. So this is a comment which seems to me right. Once someone has succeeded on the basis of being dishonest, it's difficult to return. Of dishonesty, it's difficult to return to being honest. Honesty, if Aristotle's right, is not the kind of trait you can put on and take off willy-nilly. It's a durable trait of character, and if you've lost it, acquiring it is very hard. How do I personally define success? It has a lot to do with Ducatis and BMW motorcycles, but the details are obscure and subtle, and that we'll talk about that on Tuesday. I don't have anything but sort of intellectual pablum to offer in a public forum. I think it was absolutely right for Jobs to remark to his good friend, there are things other than money. You've got enough money. I don't think you have to be as rich as those people to have enough money for it to make sense for you to pay attention to a lot of things other than how financially well off you are. The number of people I see who are quite financially successful and miserable in their life and have nothing to look back on as substantial accomplishments is huge. And I think that's no way to lead a successful life. What are the details of substantial contribution, of being able to look back on your life with some satisfaction of what you've done and of the relationships you've built? That's where I won't go into details. So I'm just giving you intellectual pablum. If I knew you better or you knew me better, we could spend a long evening over beer talking about this. Lovely question. How do you balance truthfulness or integrity with the extreme optimism success demands. What's the connection between being a glass half full? Things are going to work out. This is how it's going to go, especially when you recognize that your optimism is causally efficacious. It's by thinking it will work, that it might work. That if you give up thinking it'll work, it'll certainly fail. How do you combine that with honesty? I think the first thing to say is, what I just said is true. Many enterprises in life depend on optimism. You can recognize that, and you can be optimistic, and you can acknowledge the optimism, while also acknowledging that it's this optimism that will help make something succeed. I think you can do all of that honestly. All of that without lying to someone, yourself or anyone else. It requires things like recognizing that general statistics show this enterprise, like so many others, is going to fail. Recognizing that general fact is compatible with the particular details of your enterprise, increasing the probability of success. And then you have to look honestly at what those variables are and whether they genuinely mean that you have better than a lousy chance of succeeding if you're going around telling yourself and others that you do.
Maybe just one more.
Okay. Yes. So I'll take the top one. I guess that's the only one left, too. Since many entrepreneurs believe so deeply in their visions, is it likely that they don't realize they're being honest? I think it's even likely they're not being dishonest. Whether they're being, so you can believe fully and honestly in something that's not true. That's not dishonest. The dishonesty is when a part of you recognizes it, that it's not true. And you then promulgate what you believe to be false to other people. That's the dishonesty. Or you promulgate it to yourself. You hide from yourself. You evade the truth. So believing in your project, believing in its value, believing it's worth trying even if you risk failure just shy of the Abelard style, all of that is completely compatible with being thoroughly honest. So nothing I've been saying, I hope, is taken by any of you as an argument for not being optimistic, an argument for not believing in the worth of the projects you want to invest yourself in, for not sharing the vision you have of what you might do. It's not an argument against any of those things. It's an argument for thinking, for recognizing that when you're engaged in doing that, you will find yourself in circumstances where it will become clear to you either that the project will be promoted by lying or disaster in this project will be averted by misleading people. That's the risk. I haven't taken a stand on whether sometimes you should lie. I've just suggested that if being a liar, which is different than lying, being a liar, being the kind of person people can't trust, if that's something you want to avoid, and you go into entrepreneurial enterprises, you should recognize that that goal is at risk. Just at risk. Not lost, not sacrificed, not inevitably gone, but something that if you cherish, you need to watch out for.